Again, in that vein, it's time, I think, to introduce our first keynote speaker. Je suis très fier de voir que c'est un de mes collègues du Canada, du Québec. I'd like to introduce Daniel Chartier, Professor and Research Chair on Images of the North, Winter, and the Arctic from the University of Quebec in Montreal. He has published 15 books on the North, Arctic and Inuit, Scandinavian, and Quebec cultural studies, and has published articles in over 11 languages. I don't know if over the 11 languages, but 11 languages. Ladies and gentlemen, Daniel Chartier.
Hello all, and thank you for inviting me here. And I want to talk today about what is the Imagine North, and I think it's a very important part of what we are in the Arctic. And when we talk about discourse from the inside, there's also the discourse from the outside, so I want to make a short presentation about this. So over the centuries, artists and writers of the Western world have imagined and represented the cold world. White, empty, pure, far, unexplored, cold. Those are the main characteristics of the simplified yet powerful discourse that constitute one of the oldest and richest imaginary space, the North. This discursive and semiotic system falls into differentiate imaginary. Let's think of the North itself, Scandinavia, Greenland, the Arctic, the poles, even the winter, that are presented by a simplification of forms and colors on the presence of ice, snow, and a complete range of cold, sometimes on moral and ethical values. Let's think of solidarity, for example, but also on its connection with the beyond, where the Arctic begins, at the end of the European ecumen, and at the beginning of a natural, unknown, empty, fragile, and powerful, uninhabited, remote world that we call the far North. The entirety of these representations form a system of signs, what I call here, out of convenience, the Imagine North. Like all represented space, the Imagine North is a product of a dual gaze from the outside and from the inside. We can distinguish between representations of the North from the outside and the work of cultures of the North from the inside. The first, when we think about representations of the North, they are fruits of principally the French, German, English, and then US-American imaginary, and they seldom distinguish between the different cultural spaces and territory, and often focus their attention up toward the Arctic and the poles, with very little consideration for the cultures, Inuit, Sam, Cree, Innu, even Scandinavian, that originate in these territories. The latter, the cultures of the North, sometimes have an extension beyond themselves. This is notably the case of Scandinavian culture, while reception in Europe benefits from a clearly positive prejudice. It does not, however, apply to indigenous cultures, which have long been marginalized, at times with the rhetorical objective of reinforcing the image of an uninhabitable Arctic, often by persistent and political and ethnic distorts. Lastly, it is important to remember two phenomena that had an effect on the perception of representation of the North, Northern cultures, and Arctic in history. On one hand, the general context of indigenous colonialism, which reinforced the silencing of cultural and human aspects of cold territories. On the other hand, the general tendency of the governance of the North, dominated by the capitals of the power in the South, who administrate according to their knowledge, so seldom based on experience, and the circumstances of their own needs, mainly national resources, mine, oil, gas, hydroelectricity, with all the gaps that can create. So there exists representation of the North and the Arctic, often Western, that are easily accessible and of great simplified semiological coherence. And there's also cultures of the North, some of which are well known, those of Russia, of Scandinavia, and others are totally unknown, like other circumpolar space and the indigenous. Of course, you would say we have to take into account demography. We say 4 million people live in the Arctic. Very well. But there's 7 billion people not living in the Arctic. So when you come from a small culture, and I consider I come from a small culture, you know that there will be always more people thinking about you, imagining you, creating works about you than you could forever have your own people say about it. If you are from Greenland, you know what I mean. More people think about Greenland than there are Greenlanders to be able to say what their country is really about. But the same thing would apply to Norway. More people know about Norway than the 5 million people in Norway that can talk to the others on the outside world. So there's always this dual perspective on the North and the Arctic and on smaller cultures. But to understand the North in a perspective of the whole, we then need to take into account its plurality of unequal visibility, and thus ask us two questions. First of all, how to define the North by the imagination? And second, according to which ethical principles should we consider cultures of the North in order to have a complete view, including notably those who have been marginalized by the South? All the discourse stated about the North, the winter and the Arctic, which can be traced both synchronically for a given period or diachronically for a specific culture, derive from different cultures and form, accumulated over centuries of discourse, according to this dual principle of synthesis and competition, form what I would call the imagined North. It is a plural, shifting science system, which function in a variable manner according to the context of enunciation and reception. In the 21st century, the Arctic is witnessing an unprecedented unveiling of cultural diversity and vitality, linking artists, culture, and societies that have never been previously in contact in human history. While developing a decade ago this notion of the imagined North, I suggested the hypothesis that there exists, beyond the diverse and divergent culture and perception about the North and from the North, a common aesthetic foundation that could then be segmented according to the characteristics that compose an ensemble of original and unique signs from a cultural point of view. This system of sign has this dual feature of being seldom elaborated by those who live in the North and have been taught in large part by others who never have been there. This poses considerable challenges for the true knowledge of the cold world, for recognition of the discourse, needs, and aspiration of those who live there, and from a cultural and intellectual point of view, for thinking the North, the Arctic, and the cold world by itself. Through the centuries, it never happened really that the Arctic can be taught by itself. It is taught through the idea from the South. And even if you are from a small culture, of course you import some of the ideas about yourself made by the others. You can react to them. But even when you react, you don't think the Arctic by itself. You think the Arctic to re-establish something that was done before. Several basic principles and several intellectual positions on the definition of the Arctic should be kept in mind. Among them, I just list them here, the variety of terms that it covers, the necessity, and we see it in this summit, of a circumpolar perspective, not a national perspective, interdisciplinarity, the necessity to take into account indigenous and non-indigenous point of view, the natural and urban aspects, multilingualism, multiculturalism, and finally, and this is very important, the need to propose new vocabulary. Do not hesitate to invent words to understand the Arctic, because the relation was not made in history. So we need to invent new words to understand what we are doing right now. The Arctic must be able to define itself as an idea by itself, although it has historically been taught to define and govern, especially over the last century, by parallel influence of powers from the south. Iqaluit was long determined by Ottawa, Fairbanks by Washington, Nuuk by Copenhagen, Yakuts by Moscow. We could add Tromsø by Oslo. So from the point of view of material exploitation, the railroads transport the mineral from the north to the south for its own development. The electric lines bring electricity to the largest city in the south. The roads allow wood to reach its market in the south. The north is taught by the southwest culture and its response to its material needs. A circumpolar vision would impose, on the contrary, considering the north en soi as an ontological and definitive manner, to take into account the links that united the different parts that compose it, as well as the distinction between their culture, their position, and their historicities. These prerequisites impose precaution without which the circumpolar region finds itself once again simplified and robbed of its capacity to think for itself. In any understanding of the North and the Arctic, the multiplicity of cultural and human aspects must be considered, even though these have been marginalized by Western tradition that projects to the cold world its Arctic dreams, to borrow Barry Lopez's expression, by a rich imaginary, a fascinating system of sign constructed over centuries of discourse, but from which the consideration of those who live in the North have been precisely excluded, as well as the part of the geographic reality of the region. We must propose and defend the idea of recomplexifying the North, the winter, and the Arctic, and to reestablish an ecology of the real that takes into account the richness and the diversity of the circumpolar world. We have long known that cultural and academic relations often precede diplomacy and political relations between states. Artists and academics meet and carry out projects together decades before cultural policy come to support them. Artists and academics are the precursor of cultural relations. Today, through the circumpolar space, new ties are established between cultures that were, until now, without any contact. These are historically new events. This is happening now thanks to transport, internet links, thanks to translation, and the will to create a polydimensional circumpolar space. This summit allows us to share experiences, discover common problems, and measure differences. It opens the way to pooling knowledge and resources to find solutions to the emergencies that characterize the Arctic: distance, weakening of traditional practices, need for contemporary art, violence, suicide, isolation. Being myself a Québécois, I fully understand and share the need to defend the fact that the most dynamic cultures of the Arctic are often small nations, small communities, aware of the importance of cultural and linguistic diversity. We live, think, and create in the North. We are part of a powerful and historically strong cultural space, profoundly anchored in the world that surrounds us. Between the individual and the universal, artists and writers of the North raise the guard of the Arctic. This Pioneer Summit is, for me, its most evocative illustration. Thank you.
Merci. Thank you very much. Thanks so much, Daniel. I think that there were some important issues that were raised there, and I think that we'll pick them up a little bit more in the conversation this afternoon around the challenges for small communities, nations, and peoples in particular.